Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to speak at this prestigious conference. I'm very glad that it has such an international audience, as we know that from questions and feedbacks we got here in Krakow. Today, I'd like to say something about Karol Wojtyła and his philosophy, strictly about his philosophy. To what extent can we consider validity of Karol's philosophy today? Is this something which can be only, I would say, relegated to the realm of history of philosophy, or something which is important, valid, and inspiring today? So, as an introduction, I would like to say that it's not easy to talk about the philosophy of Karol Wojtyła. There are many reasons for that. I'm going to point to some of them and consider the strength and appeal. One of the reasons is that Wojtyła was very intensely involved in the life of the Catholic Church, and many perceive him as a pastor and theologian. This is obvious against the background of his papacy, when he operated as John Paul II, but also his activity as a bishop and cardinal of Krakow, belonging to the same category of perception, namely as a religious figure. Additionally, his adult education was mostly associated with theology. For example, he took his PhD in theology at Angelicum University in Rome and Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He wrote many works having the clear theological imprint, and this seems to categorize him as a religious thinker. Of course, in his time in Krakow, he produced a good number of philosophy articles and books, but theology was close to him all the time. When we look at some of his philosophical work, like Love and Responsibility, we can see that occasionally Wojtyła makes a reference to theological thesis. Also, the acting person starts with a quotation taken from the writing of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes. For some commentators, these circumstances can cast a shadow on Wojtyła's intentions and maybe also his qualifications as a philosopher. Nevertheless, Karol Wojtyła was a complex figure, and any easy attempt to categorize him is unjustified. As we know, he was a poet, actor, pastor, theologian, but also indeed, he was a philosopher. He developed activities in all these fields and had remarkable achievements in many of them. Understandably, his various interests and undertakings influence one another, but that doesn't lead us to a conclusion that they were not real in themselves. In this presentation, I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation, maybe just out of conviction that power corrupts by PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So in my presentation, which I'm going to read, I'm going to concentrate on his activity as a philosopher. Of course, I'm not going to repeat his biography, which constitutes the first paragraph of the book published as a part of the project on the Polish Christian philosophy in the 20th century. My intention is to highlight some important points showing Wojtyła's rooting in the European philosophy and the validity of his achievements for the philosophical debates of today. So let me invite you to a walk through philosophy together with Karol Wojtyła. Karol Wojtyła was interested in philosophical thought, and we know that from his personal memories. Firstly, he was fascinated with the Thomistic philosophy, and this school put its decisive mark on his philosophical mind for good, on his philosophical mind for good. However, later, he met in his studies other philosophers and developed some sympathy for them. As to the latter, we should mention Aristotle, St. Augustine, Immanuel Kant, and especially Max Scheler. We also know from his books and interviews, which he gave as John Paul II, that he appreciated other contemporary philosophers, like, for example, dialogue philosophers and Emmanuel Levinas, to mention but a few. Reading the works of Wojtyła, we can see how he analyzes various philosophical concepts and finds them interesting and complementing each other, starting from St. Augustine and ending up with the contemporary philosophers. The Polish thinker discovers some interesting and worthwhile ideas which should get our attention. He subsequently uses these as specific bricks in his own projects, especially those having to do with philosophical anthropology and ethics. In all this, he cannot be accused of committing a kind of eclecticism. Wojtyła does not choose to put together those ideas blindly as if at random. He is aware that they belong to various philosophical schools which differ between themselves and cannot be easily reconciled. As an example, we can point to his treatment of the second moral imperative as formulated originally by Immanuel Kant. In Love and Responsibility, Wojtyła formulated that rule in the following way, quote, "Whenever a person is the object of your activity, remember that you may not treat that person as only the means to an end, as an instrument, but must allow for the fact that he or she, too, has, or at least should have, distinct personal ends," unquote. When we take into account the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, we realize that this German philosopher meant by a person an entity understood as a thinking subject, because in a sense he was in the line of René Descartes' anthropological dualism. Wojtyła was far from that philosophical position. He subscribed to the thesis that the human person cannot be limited to a thinking subject, cannot be identified with consciousness. The human person, as he himself declared in the same book, also, quote, "has a body and in a sense is a body," unquote. In short, for Wojtyła, the person is a bodily spiritual creature, and these two metaphysical dimensions are inseparable for an integral understanding of personhood. However, Wojtyła drew on this Kantian rule heavily. He was aware that whatever metaphysical underpinning of the person theory, the person reveals itself as a special good, having her own teleology. Thus, the Polish thinker and many other philosophers coming from various philosophical backgrounds can claim that the special status of the person is marked by its possession of non-instrumental ends. In this move, we can see how Wojtyła reads specific philosophical concepts in a way which can open up a dialogue between various projects and personalities. What's interesting in this is that his voice does not disappear. He's present in this internal philosophical dialogue as an autonomous interlocutor and gradually builds up his theory of the human person. Around the philosophy of Karol Wojtyła, there is a dispute as to what kind of philosopher he was. Augustinian, Thomist, Kantian, or maybe phenomenologist? Participants of this debate give various reasons supporting the position. My reading and interpretation of Wojtyła, taking into account all his works, is that he started as the Thomist, and in a sense he remained as such, but for him, Thomism was not a closed system of philosophizing. At a certain moment, he realized that this school of philosophy can and should be enriched. In the longer run, he developed an original version of personalism, inserted in the Thomistic philosophy, but modified by modern and contemporary schools. Thus, He can be perceived, for example, as a Thomistic phenomenologist or open Thomist when we look at him through the prism of established philosophy schools. But there is also another possibility to approach his activity. When we sketch that by starting from a methodological question, was Wojtyła interested more in and fascinated by great philosophers and their achievements, or interested in philosophical problems themselves? At first glance, it is not easy to answer this question. We can see him more intensely involved in the thought of Max Scheler as much as in the analysis dedicated to human life, just to give only one example. However, a more careful reading of Wojtyła's works reveals that although he started from concentration on great philosophical figures, I mentioned before, gradually he was more interested in problems and the solutions. It is said that when Karol Wojtyła was a professor at the Catholic University of Lublin, it happened that he had an exchanging of his views and opinions with another famous scholar of the Lublin school, namely Stanisław Kamiński. Such an exchange was nothing new. The circle of philosophers gathered around famous Mieczysław Albert Krąpiec often conducted philosophical discussions and debates. Kamiński was renowned as a brilliant specialist in the methodology of philosophy. He confronted Wojtyła after a publication of his The Acting Person, making him reproaches that there are so few references and quotations in this book. Wojtyła's reply was interesting. He said, "All right, you are a scholar, but I'm a thinker." This scene suggests quite clearly that the Polish philosopher, especially in his latter period, namely the late 60s and the early 70s, was more interested in shedding some light on the reality of the human person than strictly following academic rules in his publications. Such an assessment of Wojtyła's philosophizing is confirmed by Jarosław Marecki, who is a philosopher closely related to Tadeusz Styczeń. The latter, as is widely known, was a close collaborator of Wojtyła and later of John Paul II. Marecki claims straightforwardly that, quote, "As philosopher, Wojtyła knew how to gather semi-veritatis scattered in diverse philosophical schools. It was so because Wojtyła was not loyal to this or that philosopher in the first place, but to the reality itself as given in the experience," unquote. After his encounter with phenomenology, the Polish thinker appreciated very much the experience, and it seems that it was for him a kind of locus philosophicus. When we read his main work, The Acting Person, we can easily realize realize that this word is very common in the book, that it appears very many times. Today, we witness to a very strange situation in the contemporary philosophy. This discipline seems to be concerned with itself more and more. Many philosophers move from real problems, namely those concerning human life, society, and culture, and spend the time and energy on philosophy itself. In this move, there is a strong tendency to escape from philosophy to meta-philosophy. As a result, we have at least two consequences. Firstly, that we abandon what has been a perennial vocation of philosophers, namely problem-solving or preparing ground to do that. Secondly, philosophy concerned with itself deepens the spirit of skepticism as to thinking itself. As a result, everything can be relativized, and we are on the straight path to nihilism. Wojtyła's attitude reminds us about fundamental task of philosophy and its positive and constructive role. Back to the human person. Karol Wojtyła was undertaking various activities in his lifetime. Among those associated with his academic life, we can see a special concentration on the human being. In theater, poetry, literature, theology, he was concerned with the drama experienced by the human person in relation to God, to others, and to him herself. His involvement in the philosophical theory of personhood was a prolongation of that interest. The former was maturing slowly and gradually and took its mature shape in the work The Acting Person. This is his masterpiece, which reveals his original thinking on the person, but at the same time opens up new avenues of investigating the person. This book has in its background not only the philosophers he drew upon, but also a whole modern and contemporary anthropological tradition with its positive and critical moments, with its ups and downs. When Wojtyła was working on this important treatise, he wrote a letter to the great French theologian Henri de Lubac, in which he acknowledges a very important thing. Wojtyła confesses, quote, "I devote my very rare free moments to a work that is close to my heart, and it's devoted to the metaphysical sense and mystery of the person. The evil of our times consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, indeed in a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person," unquote. We do not know exactly what was on the mind of Wojtyła when he pointed to those menaces threatening the reality of the human person. However, knowing the academic and cultural context of the world in the late 60s, including its state of philosophy, we can point to such dangerous, or at least serious to deal with, schools of philosophy like Marxism, structuralism, and existentialism. All of them, in manners typical for them, undermined the reality of the human person, but claiming that either the person is a product of society and should be subjected to it, or by sustaining that there is only an individual closed in itself and creating itself, or finally by questioning that the person exists at all. There are only various non-human structures which secondarily give rise to other entities, including the human person. All of them lead to what Wojtyła calls degradation and pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of the person. The acting person, then, was to stem those assaults on the human being and direct attention to her uniqueness, richness, and unrepeatability. Today's social and philosophical context is far more complex, but at the same time, we still face menaces of degradation and pulverization of the human person. They come from various sources, and we can point to some of them. Firstly, there is a tendency to question the existence of the human subject and to attempt to replace it with a stream of consciousness, which is in turn understood as an entire product of the human brain. Secondly, there is also a well-established tendency to question the existence of the person and concentrate on selected personal characteristics. Such characteristics can then be ascribed to various entities, for example, to some humans, animals, even artificial machines like to computers. In the latter case, some argue that we can create artificial and autonomous subjects. For example, there is a quite advanced debate as to the possibility of artificial moral subject. Can we create such a subject using various machines, very advanced computers, and so on? This is exactly this second tendency. Thirdly, in transhumanism, the human person is considered as a structure which should be overcome and replaced by a post-human person, meaning by that a better, fitter, and more advanced, as far as her characteristics are concerned, person. Fourthly, within a radical environmental philosophy, there is a conviction that the human person is one of the entities of the material world, and her status should be leveled with other live creatures. In order to avoid a speciesism and promote an environmental egalitarianism, we should withdraw from stressing a special status and moral importance of the human being. Philosophy, created and handed down to us by Karol Wojtyła, should face all those tendencies. What we have inherited from this great Polish personalist is a basic conviction that the human person cannot be reduced to the natural world, that the person possesses her interiority, which reveals an enormous richness of her personality and spirit. Wojtyła gives us weapons to fight with anthropological reductionism and scientism. It means that in a critical exchange with the aforementioned tendencies, we can use many Wojtylian ideas, even if he doesn't offer us ready-made strategies of how to conduct such a discussion. Philosophy neglected? If there are so many important areas where Wojtyła's philosophizing can be applied, why are his ideas and projects so little known, we can ask? His main works have been translated into many contemporary languages. Why have they not made much of an impact? Of course, his ideas have been discussed in the theology circles because of studies on papal documents. Theologians are very familiar with them. However, a limited group of scholars is familiar with the original philosophy by Wojtyła. Why is it like that, we can ask? At least two answers can be given here. Maybe these are mine answers. I wouldn't say that these are all possible answers. But let me give you at least these two reasons which in my assessment are true. Namely, they just focus our attention on real causes of that quite poor knowledge of Wojtyła's philosophy. Firstly, some contemporary philosophers, even in Catholic academic centers, do not consider him as a philosopher. Maybe they are suspicious of him because of his later involvement in the ministry as the Pope and consider his philosophy books as preliminary works for his magisterial writings. Maybe they are afraid that crediting him with the status of philosopher will strengthen the status of the Catholic theology as a really universal message directed and able to be received by people of all faiths and of no faith as well. Additionally, in the model of philosophy open for theology, which is typical for Wojtyła, many philosophers perceive a danger and betrayal of philosophy itself. Secondly, the answer comes strictly from the Catholic environment. Rocco Buttiglione, famous personalist Catholic Italian philosopher, in his book published not so far, Sulla verità soggettiva, speaks directly about fears among Catholic intellectuals in discussing Wojtyła's ideas because of alleged dangers for his papal writings. Karol Wojtyła, as John Paul II, participated in the creation of many encyclicas, exhortations, and papal letters. They are saturated with ideas coined and elaborated upon by Karol Wojtyła as a philosopher earlier on. Thus, some Catholic commentators reason in the following way. Discussing the latter in a strictly philosophical and critical manner, we can weaken the former. Hence, in order to guard the teaching of the Pope, we refrain from problematizing its philosophical underpinning. At any rate, we should answer all those false strategies and worries by looking closely at what the philosopher worked out. Karol Wojtyła was an original thinker, and he left us a great deal of good personalistic philosophy. In some places, further refinement can and should be done to polish it off. What's interesting is that the Polish thinker himself acknowledged that need a number of times. However, what he worked out philosophically was interesting, inspiring, and timely. It's still valid because a body of his publication constitutes a rich set of resources which can be helpful in dealing with contemporary dilemmas. His philosophy does not need any apologetic assistance and backing. It defends itself. The better we understand his rational thinking, the better take on his theology we gain. For Wojtyła, a good theology is always preceded by a good philosophy, and vice versa. Theology is not a dangerous rival for philosophy. We can paraphrase his famous saying from Fides et Ratio and declare straightforwardly that philosophical and theological knowledge are like two wings, helping us to attain the whole truth of the human person. Thank you.